All right, so welcome, dedicated folks, here on the last day at 10 o'clock. Today, as you can see, I'm going to be talking about what exactly is extensive reading, and this basically comes out of some frustrations I've had over the last few years, talking to people, going around talking about extensive reading, and what I've just sort of discovered is that we have people come up to me from time to time, and they say, oh, I have an extensive reading program. It's not quite what you would like. Because, I do assessment, or they'd say, oh, well, we don't do enough reading, or they would make some kind of apology about extensive reading, as if they're not doing it the right way. And what I want to do today is to try to calm down those fears, and those people who feel guilty about doing extensive reading the wrong way. I want to try to include you in what I might call my own definition of extensive reading. So, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start off with basically a potted history of extensive reading. There's always been graded reading. It's been going for a long, long time. Some of the early graded readers, always means like 100 years ago. Some of the early graded readers were written by, very, very famous people in the past. Michael West, for example, after Bamford was doing a lot of readers in the 1930s. They were tend to be written by a limited vocabulary, people called Ogden, West, Hornby, Palmer, who were famous mostly in Asia. They spent a lot of time trying to write materials that were comprehensible to students. And West supplemental readers, the new method readers from 1920s and 1930s and so on, they really kick-started what we might call graded reading. Now I'll come to that distinction between graded and extensive reading in a minute. But these are the main four principles behind their work. Use previously met words, that makes sense, because you want to try to repeat and recycle language. Extra practices in the reading, to stretch the vocabulary to allow readers to see new meanings, what we might call repetitive generative use, see the words again in different contexts, and with different collocations, conjugations, and so on. And to enable them to build a foundation for further reading. So this is the kind of core start of what we might call graded reading, graded readers. And the supplemental readers by Michael West highlighted new words in bold. So they were specifically focused. So it's a little bit of what you might call attention raising, awareness raising by having the words bold. And this is a copy from the cover of one of the books. I don't know if you've seen it. They're actually quite an interesting read. Pretty boring to read, to be honest. But anyway, there we go. But in the 1970s, we had a bit of a change in the way we do these things, and this is largely brought out by a man called John Mill, who suggested that vocabulary control was not enough. The early days, many of you are familiar with the work of West and Ogden and Hornby and so on, they were very big into word lists. You may have heard of the General Service List, for example, by Michael West. They were very much into vocabulary control, make sure that we get the control in the language, which is a good thing to do. But John Mill said, no, well actually, that can lead to very boring writing, the sort of Dick and Jane went up the hill, Dick and Jane went down the hill, Dick and Jane climbed the tree. And that can get a very boring type of writing, simply trying to follow lexical conventions. So they said, no, we need good, clear writing, relevant content, careful explanation, high redundancy. Redundancy means adding in extra information into the text to help them build background information. And good control over the information, intuitive grading, structure control. This is a big difference here. Intuitive grading. So here it's saying that the writer should be able to sort of sense where the student is and write to a particular student or to a particular level. So this all led to the modern graded reader, which is early days started with the Longman structural readers and various other ones in the 1970s. We then had other people join. We had more Longman series came out, Oxford came out with a series, Penguin came out with a series somewhat later, mid-90s I think Penguin came out with their readers. And Cambridge was later than that, Sengage later than that. So now we have basically all the major players are now doing graded reading in a very similar kind of way. I want to make a quick distinction between extensive reading and graded reading. I think it's important to just show that there is a difference between these two, at least in my mind there's a difference. And you'll find some of the things I say today might be a little bit controversial, and that's fine and healthy. Extensive means to read a lot. Graded are texts which are written in a series to levels. Okay? So, if you look back in history, when we talk about someone who's someone who might be an educated person, we would talk about them being educated through extensive reading. Now, extensive reading doesn't mean what we mean. At that time, it meant reading in Greek, reading some French, reading science, reading history, reading things. So reading a wide variety of stuff, and reading a lot of it. That was an educated person. The definition of educated person had embedded in it the idea of a rich, wide variety of materials. But graded reading is a little bit different from extensive reading. I've tried to separate the two for you here. You can see largely, I have a button, but I don't have any red thing. Can anybody see the red? Nope, anyway, no mind. So what we've got, graded reading, extensive reading, material at your level, yes. This is in L2, not L1, in L2. Extensive reading in L2. We've got material at your level, comprehensible, read a lot, read quickly, enjoyable, easy. Now the difference in my mind is whether the materials are simplified or not. When you reach a certain level as an L2 reader, you don't need graded materials. You don't need to go through levels. You can jump to native materials, which are naturally ungraded. Yeah? So I make that distinction between graded reading and extensive reading. And I think it can, for some cases, be an important distinction. Not always. Largely, for most of us who deal with students who are not reading at the native level of materials, I think we can maybe conflate these two, and it doesn't really matter. But at the higher levels, when you do start thinking about students reading native materials, this distinction might become important. Anyway, what I want to do today is to try to, how shall I say, throw a cat among the pigeons. I think our field now is mature enough that we should start thinking about what exactly are we doing? What exactly are we doing with extensive reading? And to me, it's a bit of a mess. When you read articles or when you talk to people, people don't always seem to be talking about the same thing, right? And I think it's important that we start to disentangle what extensive reading is and try to work out what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about extensive reading. And here I've identified two separate things. One is the pedagogy of extensive reading. You can see all of the things which teachers and students worry about. You know, what speed are we reading out, what materials, what levels are we talking about, assessment, yes or no, how do we design libraries, how do we design book systems, and so on and so on. And you can see the list of stuff. So I call that the pedagogical side of extensive reading, or extensive listening. But at the bottom we have the ER research, or EL research as well, and this involves the academic papers. And it was very noteworthy when Tom just looked for listening on the ERF bibliography. We had, was it 5 or 6 studies came up with listening in the title, but there were 530 articles overall. So that really shows the point I was making yesterday, that listening is the junior partner. But this is an important distinction, because basically for the top part, to sort of give the game away, for the top part in terms of pedagogy, we can be somewhat loose about what we talk about extensive reading. Somewhat loose. Because we all kind of understand what we're talking about, fast, fluent comprehension of text, lots of text. But when we get down to the research part, we've got to be a lot more careful. Because many program directors who are skeptical about extensive reading want to see evidence. And if we're comparing evidence from one study which has got graded readers in it, or extensive reading in it, and another one, but they're not quite the same, they're structured differently, we're going to have different types of data coming in. So we need to make sure that when we're comparing studies between in academic papers, so we have a clearer definition. We need a clearer definition and clearer parameters and clearer explanation of what we're doing in our research than we might do in a more folk definition. And I'll come to highlight that a little bit later. So why is it important to define extensive reading and extensive listening? So obviously, so we all know what we're talking about. And so we can compare results between studies and programs to be clear about what type of reading we're doing. So on the left here, I've got a fictitious program A, which is basically the view of extensive reading that says, let's just read. More of a sort of crash and egg, more sort of purist view of extensive reading, if you will. And this is self-selected, they do 400,000 words a semester, no assessment, variety of materials, and so on and so on and so on. Basically, just what you might call a purist view of extensive reading. On the right, we've got a different program, which is teacher advised. The teacher's going around monitoring and helping, and why did you read this? And They do relatively little reading. They have M-reader quizzes, so there's assessments in there, and so on and so on. Now, both of these are ER programs, but they're quite different. So if you come along and talk to me about your ER program, and you talk to me about your ER program, we may be talking about something fundamentally different. And in order to talk a common language, we need to kind of tease out what these things are and be very careful about what it is that we're trying to explain to other people. So, while we all at some level understand what we mean by extensive reading, the devil is and can be in the details. So one of the calls I'm making today would be, could we please be more specific when we're talking about our programs? What we do, what we don't do, so that we can compare like with like, or like with not like. So, when we get to a definition of extensive reading, it tends to work a little bit like this. These are the sort of common words. If I say, tell me 10 words or 5 words that you would use in a definition of extensive reading, it's probably these things. Something to do with reading, probably books, easy, fast, fluent, a lot of it enjoyable, and something like reading at your level or comprehensible. These generally are found in most definitions of extensive reading. I'm not going to bore you by pages and pages and pages of what people have said for definitions. I'm sure you're familiar with some of them. But it's not straightforward. So when we talk about easy, what do you mean by easy? Yes. Now for some people, you may find that easy means something I need to know every single word on the page. Somebody else might say easy is, well, there are a few more words on the page that I don't know, and that's perfectly okay. So it's not clear what easy would mean, and who decides what easy means. Fast. Well, if we say the reading has to be fast, what kind of minimum speed? Do we want to be dictatorial and sort of say, well, you must read above X number of words per minute in order to get the label extensive reading? And if your students aren't reading above this, whatever number it might be, sorry, you're no longer doing extensive reading. We can't be dictatorial like that. But when we're talking about fast reading in, say, Asia might be 80 or 90 words a minute. In Europe, it may be a different figure. So we're getting sort of complicating factors. What do we mean by fluent reading, of course, right? Do we mean processing text at the meaning level? Do we mean processing text at the word-by-word level? What do we mean by a lot? Is reading 2 graded readers a semester extensive reading? Yes or no? Is reading 50 or 20 or 10 or 5? Where's this line between yes, you're doing extensive reading and no, you're not doing extensive reading? Enjoyable. Why is that important? Well, clearly it's a good thing to have, but I'll come to the point, I'll revisit this point later on. But not all the things that we read are necessarily enjoyable. Yeah? In real life, there are lots of things we read, reports and that kind of thing, we need to read, which we don't always enjoy. And reading at your own level. And here, what do you mean by own level? Well, some people would say I-1, they might say I, they might say I+1, I+2. And it depends on how the student feels when they read that might matter. So we need to be careful. The definition shouldn't be too loose, and it shouldn't be too strict. We need to be, as Mark very usefully says, we need to have a big tent to include everybody, as much as we can. You're all familiar with these 10. You probably know them by heart by now. And it's time, I think, that we revisit this. In the latest edition of Reading in Foreign Language, we have 6 papers. They're all looking at the definition of extensive reading. I believe the next issue of Reading in Foreign Language has 6 more articles about that. Maybe some of you are authors here. You're all familiar with them, so I'd like to go through them basically one by one. But I do want to stress one very important point. These 10 principles have often been used to say that this is the way that we do extensive reading. Richard and Julian never said that. What they did say was, this is just stuff that appears in many typical successful ER programs. That list is not, is not a definition of extensive reading. It's not. But it's often seen as a definition of extensive reading, as it has led to an awful lot of confusion. Okay. So it's a list of suggestions, and there are, of course, issues with it, which we'll come to. But why is it important to look at that 10? Those 10 are really important because they are often seen as criteria for identifying what is and what is not extensive reading. And I believe, mistakenly, So if you take, it's often used for definitions. Here we've got several papers there that use the top 10 as their definition of extensive reading when they're doing their research papers or other papers. These tend to be the default definition of extensive reading, despite the principles only being seen as suggestions. But then you get to the extreme. There was a paper just recently by Rowan Chen in Reading in a Foreign Language that said, rather worryingly, in my mind, we purposely avoided using extensive reading terminology to describe our participants' reading behavior. This was because we did not investigate whether the participants followed any of the top 10 principles. That means, if our participants didn't, therefore they're not doing extensive reading. That's why we avoid the term extensive reading. So, in the mind of some people, these are kind of like the holy list, the 10 commandments, as Tom was saying before. So we have to be very careful to look at these. These are the 10 again. I think 3 of them are basically uncontestable. They're ones that we can say, basically, yeah, okay, these are largely all right. So let's look at each one of them. So these are the first 3 principles, 1, 2, and 4. Reading is easy, variety of material, read as much as possible. I think hardly any of us can disagree with that. We might quibble on the edges, but basically, we're okay, I think, with that. However, one problem I have with that, the bottom line, but some programs are limited in what they can achieve, their budgets and resources. So, if we have an extensive reading program that's got a library, but the books are not easy for the students, or maybe there's not a wide variety, maybe it's a very small range of materials that they've got, or maybe there isn't a lot of it. Now, simply because of the library, do we take away this label of extensive reading, say, sorry, you don't have interesting wide variety of material, you don't have an ER program. Clearly we can't do that. But we have to remember that not all libraries are able to meet those conditions. We shouldn't take the label extensive reading away from them. If we look at principle 3, learners choose what they want to read. Yep, that seems to make sense, I would say. But often, and people have been talking about at the conference here, that we need some guidance. They need to be told what to read. This is good for you, that's the right level. They need some kind of guidance, some kind of monitoring. Because as you know, too much choice can bewilder. I'm sure all of us have been into the supermarket trying to choose some jam, and you've got 1,000 jams to choose from. I'm not even going to bother trying. Right? Just walk away and buy no jam, because there's too much. And I've seen students go into our lab and go, oh, you know, there's just lots and lots of stuff. So sometimes we need to restrict them and say, look, just look here. Rather than choose one of these big box of books, here are 5. Choose one from these 5. And that might help our students, I think, make choices better than choosing randomly, almost randomly from a huge library. So they do need some guidance. Principle 5, the purpose of reading is usually related to pleasure. Ideally, of course, that makes sense. But we often have to read things we don't want to or don't like to read. Yes? Nobody likes reading documents from, let's say, from manuals. Nobody likes reading legal documents, for example, but we have to read them. And some of our students will be reading things in their English language use in the future that they don't like reading. So if we restrict them only to things they like reading, we've got to be a little bit careful. Are we actually preparing them for their future needs? So what if the library has nothing at their level, for example, and nothing that they like? Yes, there may be libraries that have lots and lots of books, but nothing that 2 or 3 students like. Can we now say to them, okay, sorry, you don't need to read because there's nothing that you like? We can't do that. Right? What if a student only reads, say, crime novels? Yeah, they say, I like crime, and they only ever read crime novels. The problem doing that, of course, is crime novels has its own list of words, and they would read constantly within that limited vocabulary, and they wouldn't be meeting many, many words they need for their general English. They'd be getting the depth in crime novels, but not in other areas. So, yes, it might be reading for pleasure, but we should also nudge them away from reading for pleasure to help to make sure their general language is covered as well. What if a student says that, for me, pleasure means easy, but they only ever stay with easy reading? Because their definition of pleasure might be different from our definition of pleasure. What if pleasure equals reading only one series? I really like Sweet Valley High. I really like Foundations Reading Library. I don't want to read anything else. I love Sue Leather's books. I love Oxford Bookworms. What if pleasure for them means I +5? But some of them really like reading difficult stuff. They like the challenge. And if that's what their pleasure is, should we take that away from them and say, no, 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 you should be reading at a lower level? And what if pleasure for some people is grammar books and word counts? There are some people out there who love that kind of study. They don't like the fluency practice. So this label of pleasure is iffy. It changes with the student. Reading is its own reward. This is something that Tom was talking about yesterday. This suggests that reading could be optional. Again, we can't say to students, I want you to learn to read for its own reward. Yeah? Because maybe they don't want to do that. Maybe they just read because they have to. Yes? We require them to read. If we say you can opt out because you don't like reading or you hate reading, we can't allow them to do that. But if our primary responsibility as teachers is to make sure that students are meeting the language. And I think that trumps everything. As far as I'm concerned, teachers are being paid to help their students learn. We shouldn't allow them at some point to take options and say, I don't want to do that. We should at some time require them to do things, even things they don't like, because the bigger responsibility is to help them learn the language. Reading is its own reward tends to assume that students will find their homegrown book. And therefore, wow, I've just discovered reading, it's fantastic, now I'm going to love reading for the rest of my life. There's an assumption that you will find your homegrown book. And many, many students in my classes, at least, have read hundreds of books, or tens of books, and they still haven't found a homegrown book. They're still doing it because I tell them. Another problem here is, as I say, students hate reading, will probably always do so. Yeah? They're just not reading people. They might prefer to listen, for example. They may prefer grammar, they may prefer something else. And it assumes that any form of reading can be pleasurable. It also suggests that assessment is unnecessary. Reading is its own reward, basically says assessment, no, we don't need to worry about that. Because the idea is we want to ennoble them for the longer term. But schools need to collect data, scores, and validate the reading that has been done, which is why we have things like MReader. Many students want to be, they like to be assessed. And we shouldn't deny them the opportunity of being assessed. We shouldn't take the position that I believe X, therefore you should do as I say. We should be where the students are. If the students want to be assessed, and the program wants them to be assessed, then we assess them, despite what I say. Yeah? I think we need to make sure that we focus on student needs rather than my personal beliefs. And we may need to collect data for action research, as Frederica was saying. She said collect some data. At times you need to have numerical data. So reading its own reward, we might not always be applicable. We may need to bring in some form of assessment. Number 7, reading is slower rather than faster rather than slower. Makes sense. Faster reading leads to higher comprehension. It's better quality of comprehension if you're reading faster. So that's a good thing to do. But some readers prefer to read slowly, so they catch all the details. There are learners, I'm sure you've all met learners, who like to read slowly and carefully. That's their style. And, I mean, for, say, in academic writing, I mean, are you going to skim read a document, a legal document? Probably not. You're going to read it carefully. Yes. So there's a time we can read slowly and a time we can read quickly. We can't always assume it has to be faster than slower. And also in reading circles, I'm sure you're all familiar with reading circles, students may be asked to read more intensively. So in a reading circle, you may be given the role of like word finder for your group or culture point finder, where you naturally are not reading necessarily fast, but you're reading more carefully. Yeah? So what my point here is that, yes, generally fast is better, but in our pedagogy, we don't always require students to do that. So should that be a necessary part of the definition? Number 8, reading is individual and silent. Well, if it's silent, it's saying there that the sharing it denies the sharing of what we read. It assumes that all that a student needs is in their own heads. Yes, we don't need to refer to anything outside our book. It also kind of focuses students inwards. That is, the reading is all I need to focus about. I don't need to have any distractions. I don't need to have a dictionary. I'm not allowed to talk to people. I'm not allowed to discuss things with other people. Not allowed to check my comprehension, and so on. And I think if students do have buddy reading, where they're reading something together, they can co-read something, or read it together. That principle denies that. Also, many students like to read while listening to text. That's clearly not silent. We know that reading while listening, Anna's research showed us that we learn more vocabulary from reading while listening than we do from reading only. So, this principle that kind of goes against that. And reading while listening also is this listening practice, this actual careful listening where they can see how words are segmented and parsed into various the elements of how string of text is parsed and broken down into its components. In some cultures, I was in Thailand just recently, and there they believe that one of the reasons that students in Thailand don't read much is it's a social culture. And reading by yourself is considered a definition of loneliness. And so therefore, do we want to promote this idea that silent reading is what you want? Do you want your students to be seen and perceived as being lonely? It also denies the oral tradition of reading aloud to others, reading from parents to children, from teachers to young children, for example. And I think we need to make sure that the reading that they get, even if it's extensive reading focused on fast, low comprehension of text, we can still read aloud to students. It's still a valid form of extensive reading. Number 9, teachers orientate and guide their students. That makes sense, but it assumes that teachers know a lot about their students and their preferences. Most of us, when we start an extensive reading program, we get 30 new students, we can't even remember their names for a few weeks, let alone what their preferences are, and all these other things that's important, yes? But this assumes that we already know our students, and the reality is we don't always know. And also assumes that teachers know a lot about their libraries, and many of us do, but not many of us don't. Many of those teachers who are required to do extensive reading, who aren't emotionally invested into their library, probably don't know their libraries very much. And therefore, here this principle might not work so well. The teacher is a role model of a reader. This is often framed that when the students are reading a foreign language, we should be sitting down reading a foreign language in front of them to be a model reader. I have a problem with that. I think reading in front of students, I don't think it's a particularly good use of time. I think one of the problems is that this principal walks past the window of your classroom. They would say, oh, well, look, that teacher's being lazy or unprofessional. They may say that the person's uncaring about the students. And they may say, look, if that's what the extensive reading teachers are doing, they're just reading in class. Why am I paying them all this money? Let's just cut this program. Yeah. So we have a bit of a potential problem there. And students may go out to their parents and say, I did my reading class today, my teacher was just reading a book, didn't help me at all. Right? And people who misunderstand the reason behind this is may lead to potential problems. The other thing too is that not all teachers are literature fanatics or lovers, yes? All of us do like to read, but not everybody is a literature lover, and not all of us have a passion for reading. So we shouldn't require people who don't have a passion for reading, teachers who don't have a passion for reading, to read in front of students. I think it's a better use of your time is to discuss your reading with your students. If you love reading, then say, hey, I just read this wonderful book. This is about it, this is what it is, this is wonderful, and so on. Or, discreetly, just leave a few novels. Let's say you're learning Japanese, leave a few Japanese novels on your desk to show that you're actually reading in Japanese. Yeah? So a bit more discreet. And the other things, these are some of the points that the principals don't really take care of very well. Assessment and evaluation, collaborative reading, reading while listening, follow-up exercises, and you can read the list there. The principals aren't really taking all of these things into account. Yeah? And I'll come back to some of these later. So the principals seem to be moving towards a unidimensional view of extensive reading in the Dame Bamford mold, and as they're perceived. And you can see the basic idea is you choose your own text, you read for pleasure without assessment, and extensive reading is a solo activity. Now I would put the case that yes, that's a valid form of extensive reading. But I would say it's not the only form of extensive reading. So what exactly is extensive reading? Read it the I+1 or I-1, short text, long text, does that make a difference? Do we read for pleasure, start with simple stories or not? And so what we have here are various dimensions of the pedagogy of extensive reading, which we can pick and choose from. So, what's missing from these 10 principles? Anything to do with pre, while, and post activities, how we support extensive reading before we start, while we're doing it, what we do after, that's not mentioned at all. Definitions of what each principle means, they're not really quite clear, they're quite vague. Listening is not mentioned at all, extensive listening is not mentioned at all. Student desires and preferences generally aren't taken into account. And speed reading development, etc., etc., etc. And the last etc. is a joke for Tom. So the summary, they seem to suggest a single way. They're not very inclusive, in fact rather restrictive form of extensive reading, I would suggest. They can lead teachers to feel guilty they're not doing the right thing. Yes. And as I said at the beginning, many people have come to me saying, look, I'm sorry, I'm not really doing extensive reading. And I think it's harmful to have us as an industry to work only in one definition that's along these lines, because it disenfranchises many of the people who are doing wonderful work in extensive reading, and we need a bigger tent to include more people. We also have to be careful about deciding things for students. These principles can be seen as a diktat, that is, you must do so and so and so and so. And I mentioned before, we sometimes have to put our own beliefs to one side, but focus on what students need. What do they need? The program needs assessment, we do assessment. Right? Rather than say, I'm not doing it because I don't believe it. I think we need to focus on what the program, what the students need, maybe what the parents need. The larger context, I think, is more important than our own beliefs. But if you don't agree with them, then work within the system to change the system. The other thing I think is very important about these things is they tend to put things in opposition. It's sort of like, we do assessment, or we don't. You know, the student selects the material, or they don't. And I think this is a rather unfortunate thing, because there are many people who say, I don't do assessment. And I think what we need to do is reframe that a little bit and say, rather than I do or I don't do, we need to say, okay, what's the role of assessment in extensive reading? How much assessment promotes extensive reading? How much can actually make it difficult for extensive reading? So rather than just throw the baby out with the bathwater, we need to include it sometimes and work out what the right balance would be. Similarly, with intensive reading, we shouldn't have studies that say, let's compare intensive reading with extensive reading, because that to me is a false dichotomy. They're two completely different things. We don't criticize a Ferrari for not carrying cement. Right? They're built differently. They do different things. Intensive reading does something differently from extensive reading. So just because in a research study, under intensive reading you learn 30 new words, and extensive reading you learn 10 new words, the assumption is we need to just throw away extensive reading because it's not as good as intensive reading. Clearly that's the wrong model. We can't have that. What we need to do is to say, what's this relationship between intensive reading and extensive reading? How much intensive reading do we need to build up the threshold of knowledge so they can then move to extensive reading? That, to me, is a decent research question, rather than have things that are in opposition. And I think these principles tend to force people to make decisions one way or the other, rather than see how these things work together. These are some of the variable pedagogical dimensions of an extensive reading program, and you can see here, there's quite a list of them, conducted in class, they can be required or not. Some people want to require extensive reading, some people say, no, 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 reading is its own reward, it should be optional. And I have a problem with that. My own particular view is, we require this reading for everyone. Going back to what I said before, is that teachers' primary responsibility is to get the students to learn the language. We shouldn't allow them to opt out. And so we need to make sure the students are doing this. If they don't do this, they'll never find their homegrown book. Right? So we must require them, at least initially, to do some of the reading. And there's a lot of research shows that even students who are required to do the reading, many of them do eventually end up liking extensive reading and extensive listening. The other dimensions are it's enjoyable, monitored, assessed, and so on. I've been through quite a few of these things before. So these are all variable dimensions within an extensive reading program. So we need a big tent. We need to accept that many students are not brought up to be responsible for their learning. So sometimes we need to make decisions for them, or encourage them to make decisions. So just leaving them alone to choose their own books might not necessarily be the best thing in all cultures and with all students. We need to encourage self-directed learning. Encouragement for self-directed learning is often ignored in favour of other things, clubs, social life, and so on and so on and so on. Yeah, if you ask a student, please do this reading, an extra hour a week, sorry, I can't do it. Their clubs, their social life, their smartphone is more important to them. And sometimes it's very difficult to motivate students. There was a wonderful study done a few years ago on, in the medical field, and what they did was to work out about the strongest possible motivation you can have in your life, which is life-saving medicine. And they wanted to find out what percentage of people would take this life-saving medicine, knowing that if they don't take this medicine, they will die. It's not 100%, 70%. So we can only get 70% of people who know they're going to die if they don't take the medicine. God help us, for those of us who have demotivated students or unmotivated students. We have a tough job ahead of us, right? So we shouldn't be surprised that no matter what we say, it's not going to necessarily get everybody to be motivated. It's often very hard for them to find time. Motivation is very difficult. As I said before, massive choice can overwhelm, and class reading is a valid form of extensive reading. It's also more than just graded readers. There are research articles now which are coming out that are saying things like, we did the students, there were 40 students, they did this, group A did this, group B did that, they were reading graded readers, and therefore da-da-da-da-da, this is my results, da-da-da-da-da. Extensive reading really works. It's like, hang on, oh, hey, go back a step, you know? The use of graded readers equals extensive reading? Huh? Because you can be reading graded readers intensively. So one of the points I want to make is that if we're going to be talking about what extensive reading is, be specific. You can't just say using graded readers equals extensive reading, because you can't prove what that level of comprehension was, what speed they were reading, whether they're processing text fast, quickly, fluently, and so on. So we have to be very, very careful about assuming that just because they've got graded readers in front of them doesn't necessarily mean they're doing extensive reading. They may be doing something else. Now, the point that I'm coming to is that there are many, many types of ER programs. A purist program, an integrated program, class reading programs, and so on and so on. Or we can have ER as literature. A purist program is more Krashenite, very much like the Dame Bamford principles. Basically, just read. Get on with it, no assessment. Off you go. Integrated program is probably the most standard one, where you've got a program that's part of a larger program. There'll be listening classes and speaking classes and writing classes, and it's all integrated together. Class reading is where all the students read the same book. They're all reading, for example, Shakespeare in Love. All the students read it together, maybe a chapter a week, and they go through and discuss it and work through it together. Or they may choose literature. They may choose several graded readers by Thomas Hardy from various publishers and examine the work of Thomas Hardy. And lastly, easy ER, start with simple stories, which is a big thing that's happening in Japan now. The belief is that everybody, when they're starting extensive reading, should go right the way back to extremely easy text to build up their fluency so they don't have to translate in English. And this is a very important, a very powerful tool being used in Japan. But this means there's many different types of ER programs, different aims, different involvement for teachers and students. Some programs may adopt 2 or 3 different types. You may have something that's integrated. You may have part of it also where you've got class reader at one point, then you may do ER as literature. So you may find in an extensive reading program you've got different flavors of extensive reading going on, not just one form. Some programs can start more easily than others, and each type is scalable. Yes, all of these programs are scalable, so you can start with one class and scale them up to maybe a year, a whole school, a school district. But there's no best type. This is sometimes people come up to me and say, what's the best way to do extensive reading? There isn't one. There isn't one. It's what your students need and what you can do with the resources that you've got that matters. So this is the kind of table of all of these things. If you can cast your eye briefly over that, so we've got the classical all the way across to the easy forms, the style, the amount, the speed, the control, and so on. I see some people taking pictures. You don't need to, because at the end I'm going to give you the URL for downloading a PowerPoint if you wish. Save your camera. Okay, so where does our definition of extensive reading start? I think one of the core points we need to make for extensive reading is to look at the cognitive dimension. Students should read something quickly and enjoyably with adequate comprehension so they don't need a dictionary, R-E-A-D. I think this is the basic, solid, core part of extensive reading. This is really where we need to be. And to be called an extensive reading program, if your students aren't doing this, maybe you should have some other label for the program that you're working with. Yeah? That to me is the core part. But I want to make a distinction, a clear distinction between the process of reading and the pedagogy behind extensive reading. ER, if you look at the definition before, R-E-A-D, ER is a way of processing text. There's a cognitive dimension to extensive reading, the way that we read. Fast, fluent comprehension of text. And this is independent of how long you read, how much you read, and what you read. If you're processing text cognitively, at a fast, fluent comprehension level, we can say that that actually comes up with a term called rauding by Carver. Carver came up with a term called rauding to describe where you're processing text fast, fluently, you understand processing the text, the grammar, the vocabulary, sentence level, and you are processing the whole text fluently as if you do in your first language. So there's a way of processing text. Yeah. 5? Yeah? Okay. But the pedagogy of extensive reading is another dimension of that. It's a completely different dimension. So the core elements of an ER program necessary to maintain the label extensive reading are both the cognitive dimension and pedagogical dimensions. There are two separate dimensions. I would suggest that a fluent, sustained comprehension of text, meaning through meaning-focused input through rauding, would mean that you're doing extensive reading. It should also include large volume of material, reading extended periods of time, not just reading one book and then leaving it, not just 1 or 2 books per semester. Texts are longer, requiring comprehension at the discourse level, not just at the sentence level. And I think this is the sort of aim we need to be working towards to call our programs ER programs. That shouldn't deny work done to get to that level. Part of an ER program might include some phonics. It might include other work that helps students to get to that threshold. But this is sort of where we need to end up, something like this. But we must tread carefully when we're thinking about defining extensive reading. We have to be careful about dictating what should be and what shouldn't be in a program. I think we can all kind of agree that there's a core there somewhere, and I think we need to be careful about retaining that core. But at the same time, we have to remember that some programs are limited in what they can achieve. They may not have the resources, they may not have the right materials, they may not have all kinds of different things, the amount of time. Yes? But we don't want to take away the extensive reading label from them. They can still retain the extensive reading program label, but be careful about that when we're talking about the cognitive process. I don't think it's helpful to specify speeds or volumes or whether you should or shouldn't do assessment. I don't think that's helpful. I think if you believe that you're doing extensive reading from a pedagogical point of view, I believe that's perfectly okay. But when we get to research, we must be a lot more careful. Because a lot of the justification for what we do for programs, to ministries, to schools, to administrators, depends on the quality of our research. And we need to be very specific when we're talking about ER research about what exactly we mean by extensive reading. Just using graded readers in your experiment doesn't necessarily mean that they're being read in an extensive way, as I've described here. So what I would suggest that you do in your research is add in what's the average speed reading level. How many words per minute? And if it's low, maybe comprehension is low. Add in, when you're explaining your research and describing the program, tell us a bit more about who the students are, a lot more background about levels of comprehension, as I said, reading speed. We need to know that they're kind of following the READ principles. We need to make sure that's in our research, and don't just assume that because we're using graded readers, it's no good. So, conclusion. Extensive reading is multifaceted. For pedagogy, we can have a big wide tent, but the core is READ. For research, we be much more careful about what we're doing, a lot more careful about what we do, so we can compare studies and move forward. Many of the things I've said today might be contentious. I'm sure I've ruffled a few feathers here, but I think our industry is strong enough now to be able to move forward and start to discuss more carefully about what we mean by extensive reading, so that in the future our students will be rewarded better by the work that we do.